Welcome to Plato's Cave. I'm Jordan Myers, and I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. You're listening to a reading group episode of the show, which means that in this episode, I discuss the paper Reply, The Free Will Revolution by John Martin Fischer with three non-philosopher friends, Adam, Giffin, and Brian, because philosophy shouldn't just be for philosophers. And so, in this episode, we really do a continuation of the previous episode in the Moral Responsibility series. That paper was on semi-compatibilism by John Martin Fischer. And when we read that paper and discussed it, there were a few sort of outstanding questions that we all had. And so we decided to look at an earlier paper by John Fischer and see if we could find any answers there. Brian was not a part of the previous episode, but he did join us for this episode. So there's a little bit at the beginning of sort of going over ground that we tread in the first paper. But if you found the previous episode interesting, if you're interested in John Fischer's view or reasons responsive compatibilism generally, I think this episode is a really good one. And this clarified my understanding of reasons responsiveness, but also clarified sort of the relevant questions that I think are worth asking, which is always a good thing to do. So with that introduction, I hope that you enjoy our discussion of John Martin Fischer's work. Okay.
And then the other thing I was thinking about, could we try this time? Because I feel like in our past podcasts, we get kind of bogged down on points. And it's great to discuss points in depth. But I think what happens a lot of times is we alienate points to the point where viewers don't really understand what we're talking about.
Yes.
So I think it's really important that we just really try and be biased towards getting through the entire paper so the entire scope is revealed, and then diving into those smaller points. We can, I think, talk about those smaller points as they come up, but I don't really want to dive into points too much until we've kind of seen the entire thing being fleshed out.
I totally agree, and
especially
also
on this one, because I'm a confused with this paper, to be honest.
I'm actually on that topic. I'm actually against going over the section of the transfer of
the final section. Yes.
I Googled the definition, I read it, and I was going into one of the papers, and I'm like, this is actually like a whole area of philosophy we've never touched on.
No.
And he doesn't actually give a definition in the paper and just gives a critique. So I don't want to, it's not even like we just haven't really touched on
we don't have the credentials at this
point.
point.
I read his critique twice, but I'm like, I don't know actually know.
I don't know a damn thing about this.
Yeah, exactly. So, but that would be my one area would be, it's just a short, just a one-page part of the paper that I think is worth not touching upon.
I couldn't agree more with both inclinations there. And also, I didn't realize this, but this entire paper is a response to a symposium, which is super cool because this plays into, Brian, your whole thing about I have a lot of questions. That's good. You should and like definitely be extremely liberal with asking them, because I actually had forgotten too that you missed the previous episode. The previous episode, let alone the entire first
let alone
series,
the beginning of the series. I mean, that's what I can serve as in this episode, though. Is just
exactly
questions.
Because for the other two, like I would assume this was a shared experience of yours, where it's like, oh wow, there were just kind of a lot of very interesting doors opened by this, because it was written in 2005. The title of it is Reply, The Free Will Revolution, and it's in Philosophical Explorations. But it was published in 2005. And then the paper that we read, which was itself sort of a summarizing view of Fischer's work on semi-compatibilism, was in 2012. So we're actually reading an earlier paper, but the interesting thing about it is that it's in largely a reply to McKenna, Speak, Judish, and Seth Szabo. So I think the two sections that are actually super good are the first two for us to go over, the structure of semi-compatibilism, and then I know we'll be talking a lot about the mechanism ownership part.
We're not going to jump the gun on that one, but
So maybe what I should do is Maybe I'll just read the majority of the first paragraph because both for the listeners and for us, it gives a nice kind of review of the previous episodes slash review of just his overall position on this. And then maybe even Brian, if you have any questions just based off of that, we can get them on the table. Yeah.
Basically, just go and then I'll interject.
Okay, nice. So it says, so I'm going to just quote from it. I have argued that moral responsibility does not require the sort of freedom or control that involves genuine metaphysical access to alternative possibilities, regulative control. Rather, guidance control is the freedom-relevant condition necessary and sufficient for moral responsibility. When an individual controls his behavior in the pertinent way, he acts from a certain sort of general capacity for reason's responsiveness. A bit more specifically, an individual exhibits guidance control of his behavior insofar as it issues from his own moderately reasons responsive mechanism. On this sort of view, an agent need not have access to alternative paths into the future in order to be morally responsible. The relevance of what happens along non-actual pathways is to specify the modal or dispositional features of the general capacity in question. Semi-compatibilism holds that causal determinism is compatible with moral responsibility, quite apart from the issue of whether causal determinism is compatible with genuine metaphysical access to alternative possibilities. I'll read the last line because it's nice. The future may or may not be a garden of forking paths, in Borges' notable phrase. Nevertheless, we can legitimately be held morally responsible for how we take our own path into the future. I didn't even know. It's cool that Fischer likes Borges too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So quick couple definitions: guidance control versus regulative control. I'm struggling to see the distinction.
So this is a return to the previous episode, but it's worth reviewing because it's a really important distinction. So regulative control is the ability to do otherwise. So in Frankfurt's terminology, it's the principle of alternative possibilities, or alternate possibilities. So regulative control is actually Borges's Garden of Forking Paths is a good illustration of it. So the idea that you might have regulative control is the idea that in your life, there's a bunch of different pathways. There's all these possibilities. And if you have regulative control over yourself, you could freely choose to go down one path or another. It's this kind of, it's basically the notion that libertarians are endorsing with contra-causal free will. Like I can override my deterministic background, right?
That makes sense. You can easily just deter. Yeah.
Exactly. And Fischer does not think that we need that for moral responsibility. And I don't think he thinks that we even have that. Right. So it's not. Now, guidance control is different than that. And it's more sort of local. It is, I forget his exact, terminology that he uses in the 2012 paper, but it's basically the idea that you act in the world in such a way that you can manifest your intentions. Right. It's this sort of it's basically kind of having like power over things in the world. Right. So guidance control would be if I have the desire, the intention to turn my car left and I turn the wheel left and the car goes left. Right. That's me exercising guidance control over the car.
So it sounds like you're saying that like it's kind of goes hand in hand with a determinist understanding of the world, except that there is some sort of semblance of choice.
So it's compatible with so determinism doesn't have to be false in order for you to have guidance control. So basically, it doesn't matter that, of course, given the state of the universe, if we like pressed pause and rewound it and then pressed play it again, I would still make that left turn every time. Right. I don't have the alternate possibilities to make a right just because of determinism, but I exercise guidance control if in fact I sort of have, he uses, I don't remember the language he uses, but it's sort of like local power over a situation. So for instance, like I couldn't make the car take off, right? Like into the air. Like I just don't have the ability to do that. I don't have the guidance control over that, but I have the ability to make it turn left or right. And normally I can do either of those things. Yeah.
So are libertarians don't think that you can have the car take off, though, right?
No,
Okay.
I wasn't trying to imply. That
Yeah,
they're
I
up-
guess
they're up the-
I guess yeah. To me, it was always yeah. I guess
It's just intention aligning with actions.
your
So,
intentions get
yeah,
manifested. Yeah.
yeah. So it's like, a libertarian might say, okay, you could have turned left or right at the light, but then a determinist would say you could have only turned right, but then under this model, it's not an issue if you could only have turned right because your intention was to turn right. So your guidance control indicates, or you had guidance control where
Okay.
behavior aligned with intention.
okay. So it sounds like you're deciding to go right, but you could have only decided to go right. That's what I'm hearing, which sounds like determinism.
Yes. So, and that's why they're compatible. It's like in the sense that it's not like, behavior purely manifests outside of your intention. Like you're not going, if you intend to turn right, but then the car turns left,
Mm-hmm.
and let me actually rephrase that for a second there.
Mm-hmm.
Because say in a purely deterministic world, you had intended to turn the car right, but the car turns left, then, or you turned the car left. Let's say you turned the car left, but your intention was to turn it right.
Yeah.
Well, now behavior isn't a manifestation of intention.
Mm-hmm.
But, if you turn right and you had intended to turn right, even in a deterministic world where you could not have turned left, behavior at the very least does manifest, or intention does manifest in behavior.
Okay.
Does that distinction make sense?
That does
there?
make sense.
Okay. So it's like an important nuance. It doesn't give you libertarian free will, but it's just that behavior
it sounds like it still says that there's a semblance of choice, even though you wouldn't have made another choice.
Yes, exactly. Because it's like there's at least that alignment between what you intended and how you behave.
Okay.
Can I try to illustrate it in one last way, and then we'll maybe move on?
Yeah, then let's definitely move on.
Yeah. So one way is to kind of differentiate, like create a case in which the two break apart. So for instance, let's say, in both cases, you have the desire to get ice cream, Brian. But in one case, ice cream just doesn't exist. It hasn't been invented yet. And in the other case, it has been, and you're right next to a store that sells it, right? So in neither of those situations did you have the ability to do otherwise with respect to your desire for ice cream. You wanted it in both cases. But in one sense, you could exercise guidance control over acquiring it. It's like practically possible. Your intentions can be manifested. Okay. Does that make sense?
I think that does make sense. I'll ask more questions if they come up during the paper.
Good. Adam, that was coherent, right?
Yeah. I think that's just another good way of looking at it too, because I think there are several different ways of looking at the regular control and guidance control. So, but I think that's a good way of looking at it too. And
he says that guidance control breaks down into those two parts. That's basically the rest of this paper. Reasons, moderate reasons responsiveness, and mechanism ownership.
Okay, cool.
So I think if we're kind of loosely following the trend of the paper, we're going to end up looking at the moderate reasons responsiveness first. This actually, I'm actually curious, maybe for Adam and Giffin. Well, maybe we can just get into it. This actually clarified.
Just for Brian's sake, though, he doesn't actually go back into defining moderate reasons responsiveness in this paper. So is it worth just kind of touching on what we had figured out, that how we would define moderate reasons responsiveness?
It is,
for sake of discussion here.
Do you want me to explain that real quick to him?
And then I can kind of chime in.
Okay.
On, if there's any.
Yeah, this is good because this was something that I asked John Fischer about when we talked too, because there's So he remember, so being reasons responsive in the right manner is a crucial part of having this guidance control. And guidance control is what he says matters for moral responsibility. So that's how it kind of fits into the whole schema, right? So if you're now he when I say reasons responsive of the right way, I mean moderately reasons responsive. So
Okay.
moderately reasons responsive is just the idea that you maybe I should contrast it to strong and weak first. So if you're so strong reasons responsiveness would be too strict a requirement in Fisher's view. So that's the idea that if there exists a reason to do something and that reason is rational, it's legitimate, right?
It's sufficient.
Yeah,
it's a sufficient, yeah.
Yeah, it's a sufficient reason to do X. Then if you're a strongly reasons responsive agent, you always do X. So it's sort of a one-to-one match between sufficient reason and action, right?
Okay.
And that's
and also it's a reason you better recognize. So if you recognize a sufficient reason to not do X, you won't do X.
It feels like you can just call it, instead of, you could just say reasonable, right? Like it's more specific, but it sounds like it's the same thing.
Well, no.
But like say, I mean, just for the sake of like the strong, case here, say, I don't know if you want to go to a football game this year. We were kind of using this example, if you went out and like, say the ticket's like $150 and we gave you a sufficient reason not to buy that ticket, which is that it's kind of pricey.
Right.
That doesn't have to be, you could acknowledge that as a sufficient reason, but you might have other reasons, right? That would override that reason. So it's not like you're going to act upon that single reason and then just be like, oh, I recognize that as a sufficient reason and then act upon it.
Okay, so it's not enough to say you're reasonable. It's saying more than that. It's saying that there are multiple. Okay, I get it.
If there's any sufficient reason, like you'll act. With regard to that reason.
Or maybe even it's sort of like you always act with respect to like the totality of the reasons, right? So like the sufficiency of all the reasons points to X or not doing X, and then you always do X or not doing X.
That's how I imagined it.
Cool. It's like, I gotcha. It's kind of viewing you as this function with all these different variables, which each variable is a reason, and then input it together. What is that? Yeah. I think I got it.
You basically, on Fisher's account, you basically get reduced to kind of like an algorithm under that view. It's just too strong a connection between sufficient reasons and what you do. You have no freedom in that sense. Gotcha. But the other side of the coin is weak reasons responsive. And this is the opposite. It has the opposite peril, where all that matters is that you recognize some reason, like in any possible, situation, any possible circumstance, you just recognize some reason and you don't have to act on it ever, right? So it's just like this way too loose connection between reasons and action.
What if you cite a reason that doesn't make any sense? Oh, I didn't want to go to the football game because it's Tuesday. It's like, you know what I mean? It's just like, that's not like, I guess it's a reason, but it doesn't really, it's not logically sound, or it doesn't really explain why. I don't know. Maybe that's in the weeds too much.
No, it's not. So that's actually part of his moderate reasons responsiveness is that moderate reasons responsiveness holds that you will recognize as a legitimate reason all of those reasons which sort of a rational third party would recognize as reasons. And included in that bundle is sort of logical coherence. So your point about, so you want to go to a football game, but you say that a reason not to go is because it's on a Tuesday. And it's not because, you have work on Wednesday. It's not because of like any rational reasons. It's just because for some reason intrinsic to Tuesdays for you is like a non-football day. Like that doesn't, it just doesn't make any sense. And it wouldn't, and if you thought that Wednesdays were intrinsically a pro football day, like that pattern doesn't really follow. His example of this was like, his example of this was if you're thinking of going to a sporting event and you recognize that $50 is an acceptable price because it's not that much money, but $1,000 is not an acceptable price because it's way too much money. It would be extremely strange if you then thought 1,000 and $50 was okay because it wasn't that much money. Like that
Okay.
pattern makes no sense.
Like you're clearly not cohering to any kind of
Exactly, yeah.
Or Or maybe your reason is that the ticket price has to include the number 50, which is
it's like what does that mean? Yeah, exactly.
Okay, gotcha. I think I got it.
Yeah, and importantly, one last clarification about that. You need not act on any particular reason. If you're moderately reasons responsive, but you have to recognize as legitimate this kind of table of possible reasons, like I said. So it's not that you have to actually act on the fact that, you don't have to, like, when you buy the ticket, hold in your mind all of the numbers for which you would not buy it and all of the numbers for which you would. Like, you don't have to be, you know what I mean, that kind of perfect agent in that sense. But you do have to just generally adhere to that pattern. And then something that we were talking about that actually it played a big role in my thinking about this paper was, and this isn't as formally worked out because we were just talking about it in the episode, but it seems like there's also this kind of loosely based character component to the reasons responsiveness as well, which is that Fischer was saying, if you had always been sort of a very frugal person and $1,000 on a sporting event was, way too much for you and nothing in your material circumstances had changed, but yes, suddenly $1,000 was no problem to go to a football game, that also would be extremely strange and might kind of beg the question of whether you were being reasons responsive in the right way also.
Okay. So there's definitely been times where I haven't been reasons responsive. That's what I'm learning. Okay, cool. I got it. I think we can move on.
It's a good, very sort of esoteric insult to throw at someone that they're not reasons responsive. Yeah.
But also, we can just kind of table this for now.
Yeah.
I also want to discuss at some point, just like another area of critique of like this framework, which is a kind of like I don't know if it's like a time sensitive critique, but it's kind of what Brian just mentioned there, where it seems like, and we obviously can table this, but that someone can be classified as reasons responsive at one point, but then possibly at another point, we could maybe describe them as not being reasons responsive. So what are they in that moment? Are they a reasons responsive agent or are they not? So
yeah. And the part two to that question is, is that change always due to some intrusion of determinism that then begins to make guidance control looks like it collapses into regulative control? Which is something we were talking about before. Actually, I meant to say this at the top, but I wrote down on like the cover page of this paper a bunch of I just jotted down like a few questions that we had from last time, because if you guys remember, we had like, we kind of ended in a bit of aporia with respect to a lot of questions. So I don't think we'll get through all of these, but just to keep them in mind. So I'll just run through the questions. How does character tracking fit into reasons responsiveness as the requirement? Then we were also thinking about, are there soft and hard reasons which someone could recognize? So soft, they have the ability not to recognize and still be reasons responsive, and these may be character based, but the hard reasons are ones that they must recognize in order to be character based, and these ones might be the more purely rational sort of coherent pattern tracking that Brian, we were talking about the ticket prices, like something like that. Okay. Then there was also a question, I think Adam might have brought it up. Does guidance control collapse into regulative control? And then also, is mechanism ownership susceptible to intrusions of determinism, which that is more answered in this question. Then this one, I know we're going to have fun talking about this, the subjective acceptance of mechanism ownership. It just seems like an improper standard.
All things to build up to.
Yeah. And okay, the other two aren't exactly germane to this paper.
You should probably just continue and flesh out this paper a little bit more.
So I was thinking about the idea, was thinking about on 146, he gets into the critiques that have been raised against him about how parasitic his thesis is on the kind of notion of being able to do otherwise. Adam, did you find? I thought that was interesting. Did you?
I actually didn't find these critiques interesting.
Okay, we can skip past it then.
Yeah, I could have missed something here, but I didn't. I never interpreted his argument this way, and I
so
thought
it
that
wasn't exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't. I don't. He never seemed to tip his hat at actual alternate possibilities. You know what I mean? Like it's like,
yeah.
It kind of goes back to the idea of like, okay, for the sake of a hypothetical, we can look at the, how the actual sequence manifested here, as opposed to in the actual sequence in a different world, had this variable been removed, or had another reason been given, or a reason recognized, but otherwise it's I don't think it's that parasitic on that idea. Did I miss something here, or do you think there's anything to these critiques?
No, you didn't. Honestly, the level of interest that I had in it depended on if you had some sort of a strong reaction to it. In my view, I'm honestly wondering if the way he talks about it is just a little bit of a semantic mistake, as opposed to like a more theory-based mistake. Because basically, all of page 146 and 147, I take him to be saying the following. He's basically, if I'm understanding him correctly, laying out this idea that being moderately reasons responsive, and that applying to the mechanism that actually results, in the action, it doesn't hinge on you acting differently in like actual possible worlds. It seems to he seems to always bring it back to, it's about non-actual hypotheticals in this world. So for instance, if there's things about a situation X, if things about that were to change, then I should recognize those changes in reasons as legitimate, if in fact they are, if I'm reasons responsive in the right way and of the right mechanism. But I didn't understand. It doesn't seem to me like this has anything to do with the stronger kind of Frankfurt PAP sense of alternate possible worlds. Like that, I honestly wonder if that's just like a semantic mistake to even kind of juxtapose it to that. Because I took a lot of the criticism. Who did he cite? He cited both McKenna and Dan Speak about those criticisms. And I honestly wonder if it could have been avoided if he merely talked about the idea that, like, if things were to change and then your opinion of the situation changes, that's supposed to highlight the fact that you're being reasons responsive. Like, you're actually responding to the legitimate changes. Yeah, that's how I read it. Did anyone read it differently than that?
No, I mean, that's how I read it too.
No, I think that's it.
Okay, good. I was like, it was one of those experiences of reading this where I was like, okay, if he means what I think he means, I'm totally on board. If he doesn't, I have no idea what he's talking about.
What he's talking about.
Yeah. It was like you were like at the knife's edge point.
I have another definition question. Incompatibilist. To me, that's just anyone who's not a compatibilist, which includes both a libertarian and a determinist. Is that correct?
It is spot on.
Okay, cool.
Yes. That is spot on. Yeah. So you could be incompatibilist in two radically different ways like that. There's like the Robert Kane incompatibilism, and then there's the Galen Strawson incompatibilism.
Okay. So Dan Speak had an interesting sentence. He said, who cares the incompatibilist will ask what the agent would have done under different conditions, and that's in reference to what we've been talking about, the two different worlds. I kind of thought that sentence was, it feels weird to me that you wouldn't care, I guess. Like, why wouldn't you care?
Where is this? I'm so sorry.
So it's 146 in the similarly Dan Speaks, about like 5 lines down from that.
I had that very sentence highlighted, Brian.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, It is actually a really good question, because that's why I think that this is a semantic mistake on Fisher's part. Maybe I could be wrong. Um, because I think so. So Speak's question is, so the incompatibilist is going to say, yeah, right, exactly like you said. Who cares if you could have done differently under different conditions? Those conditions never arose. So like, I care what you did under these conditions, right? And that is talking about the robust. That's talking about regulative control, right?
Okay.
Which I think is why maybe if Fisher used different languages, not about like the ability to do otherwise or other possible worlds, that retort wouldn't come up, because I think that he's not saying like, so Fisher's not saying under different conditions you would have acted differently, and therefore you're either not responsible or responsible.
Real quick, this is a quote of what Dan Speak is saying. So I guess I'm a little confused. Okay, why are you saying Fisher's saying it? Or are you kind of going down a bit to the reply?
I was giving kind of the reply I think Fisher would make.
Gotcha. Yeah. You can continue.
Yeah, because Speak says the sentence after the one you read is, to carry moral weight, reactivity needs to have more than just this merely counterfactual basis. I think Speak there is attacking weak reason's responsiveness.
Okay.
But, where it's like, okay, in some possible worlds you did differently, right? Because you responded to different reasons, because there were different reasons, because the world was different. And that's obviously like, yeah, that doesn't, who cares about that? Speak's right. But I don't think that that's what Fisher's talking about when he says that, like, let's just formalize it in an example. So, what's like a good, I don't know. So you're faced with like an ethical dilemma or something, right, Brian? You're faced with, you're faced with the decision whether to kind of stretch the truth about something on your resume, right? And a reason to do it is that, well, everyone else in the field is puffing their resume, right. So I've got to puff mine to keep up.
Speak 7 languages.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll put Hindi on mine as well. Yeah. but then a reason not to do it is that you might get caught. Right.
That just speak Hindi right now.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, in some you might say like, okay, in a world in which there's no possibility you get caught, you might act differently. And like the incompatibilist can say like, okay, who cares? Like, okay, that's not the world we live in, right? And Fisher's going to say, exactly, that's not the world we live in. But the point is that if you were to react differently, given different circumstances, that's highlighting that you're actually importing and adjusting how you view the situation in conjunction with the reasons that are actually there. And I just think that the way he goes about it maybe is I don't know. It might be just a semantic mistake in that way.
And it's also like he's differentiating different mechanisms to the people operate from, in the sense that like on like page 149 he says, similarly, it may be well true that the only way a given agent could have reacted differently to an actually existent reason to do X would have been for the past or the laws to have been different. It follows, in my view, that the agent does not have access to a non-actual possible world in which he reacts differently to the actually existing reason to do X. But given that there are certain worlds in which the past and or laws of nature are different in certain respects, and the agent reacts differently to the actually existing reason, he may well be acting from a general capacity that has the property of reason's responsiveness. So I get the idea from that section right there. Half of what Jordan just said, where it's like, okay, if you were to add or subtract a reason or change the history of events, then the mechanism that you're operating from might just interpret reasons and weigh different reasons differently, but the mechanism would stay constant. But if the laws of nature itself changed, well, then the mechanism would change and might, therefore, behavior would manifest differently. So under this, it's kind of like, okay, there are distinct mechanisms that won't weigh reasons the same, and these mechanisms, given different reasons, would react differently. So that's how I'm interpreting those.
I had that exact section highlighted too.
I think that fit, just adding that in there. But that's kind of what I'm getting from this, non-actual world.
Yeah.
It's just a hypothetical.
I think he's really using this to highlight the difference between two worlds, not any details about either world. Yeah,
because the thing is, like imagine like in like an alternate world here that Jordan and I had switched places, and were to react and be to an event, and then some behavior would manifest. Well, likely he and I would react differently, because in this case we have different mechanisms that we're operating from. Or if Jordan had been faced with some ethical dilemma,
would have done the heinous thing, whereas Adam would have done just the upright thing.
No, but in the other circumstance, like if you were given a different reason, perhaps you would have, reacted or behaved differently. So I think there are kind of two things at play.
Even though you have this,
we had different mechanisms. And if the laws of nature would have been different, Jordan's mechanism might have been different, and therefore would have reacted differently.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
gotcha.
But the fact remains that he does have a mechanism that will react differently given different reasons, and also given a change in the laws or in the history of events.
Okay.
So it might be a little, it gets a little shaky about describing it as his mechanism if the laws themselves change. So, but I think I get his point overall.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. The mechanism that we're referring to can be kind of equated to like the person's hardware. It's
yes.
Yeah, essentially. Like when Adam says our mechanisms would be different, he's just referring to what makes me, and him, like our brains, essentially.
A set of physically observable things.
Or I mean, it depending on your theory of it could be anything, right? Like if you believe in a soul, it could just be different souls. Like that's just the mechanism,
Okay, whatever makes Jordan is the mechanism.
Wherever the locus of my essence is, that's what he means. And I take it that the previous example or the previous paragraph about the piano is trying to highlight that he's focused on this general ability, because his example is, even when you're in a situation in which you know how to play the piano, but you're kind of, chained to a desk and the piano's across the room, you still have the ability to play the piano, but you don't have the ability to, go play the piano for real. Right. Yeah. So he's almost like, I almost thought he might put it as like ability versus opportunity to play the piano or something like that. So what really, really matters for him is that you have this general ability of reason's responsiveness issuing from the right mechanism.
I liked his verbiage there though, because it was like capacity versus exercising that capacity.
You
know what I mean? Like I think that you put it well, but I just wanted to use his.
No, his is better. I skimmed over that. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. No, that's a better way to put it. I like that. Okay, so I basically agree with everything he says there. We might have different ways of expressing it, but I don't find anything distinctively wrong there. I don't know that that's going to be the following or the case for the following section about mechanism individuation.
No.
This is so Brian, just to get the sense of why Adam and I are so interested in this. This was our biggest question mark or point of concern with the previous paper. And honestly, it all sprung from just one kind of small paragraph in the previous paper. But okay, maybe. So here's what I'd like to do. I want to read.
Let me tie it in for Brian real fast here. Because like you might be listening to all this, Brian, and you're like, okay, but I've read Galen, and how do I? Okay, so people can be reasons respond or moderately reasons responsive. Their mechanism can, recognize, a pattern of reasons. Doesn't necessarily have to act upon those reasons, but can recognize them and then, manifest behavior on the basis of desires. But you might ask, to what degree are people actually responsible for their mechanism? So that's where I feel like Fischer kind of ties in mechanism ownership. Yeah. So which we're going to get into here, and he's got a way of kind of viewing that. So
yeah, okay. I think I'm going to read the majority of the first 3 paragraphs in this section because I think that that's required. So he says, semi-compatibilism has it that the freedom relevant condition necessary and sufficient for moral responsibility is guidance control. On my view, guidance control has 2 distinguishable elements, mechanism ownership and reasons responsiveness. One exhibits guidance control insofar as one's behavior results from one's own moderately responsive mechanism. So he has given accounts of each of these components. So my approach to mechanism ownership is subjective. One makes a kind of mechanism one's own by taking responsibility for acting from that kind of mechanism. On this sort of view, one acquires control at least in part by taking control. I and my co-author offered the following 3 conditions for taking responsibility. So the first one is that the individual must see himself as an agent. He must see that his choices and actions are efficacious in the world. 2 is that the individual must accept that he is a fair target of the reactive attitudes as a result of how he exercises this agency in certain contexts. And 3, the individual's view of himself as specified in the first 2 conditions must be based in an appropriate way on the evidence. Now, yeah, let me stop there because I have a bunch of questions about this. First of all, let me table the reason why we're so interested in it, which is Adam's objection to this in the previous episode. Adam basically brought up the point that, well, look, you could, let me explain real quickly, Brian. There's this whole sub-literature on what are called Frankfurt cases, but the basic idea of all of them is that let's imagine a device that's implanted in your brain, and this device controls all of your thoughts and desires and intentions, and it just takes control of you essentially, but in a way that it doesn't feel like you're being controlled. It's not like, my hand is raising up and I can't get it to go down. It's not like that. It would feel exactly like I'm doing, feeling now, except basically instead of me saying these words, it's, someone essentially typing in.
You're being controlled.
Yeah, exactly. So Adam brought up the objection that, wow, okay, if you're going to say that mechanism ownership is subjective and that it requires that someone just take responsibility from acting from a mechanism for that mechanism to be your own, well, then why couldn't, if you were being controlled by this external device, if that device made you take responsibility for acting from that device, that seems to fit with Fischer's account. However, intuitively, that's an extremely odd case of you owning the mechanism because it's hard to find any way in which you do own it. Does that objection make any sense to you?
That sounds, I guess it all just sounds a little bit weird to me because to me, I've kind of viewed the mechanism as the person. So it's hard for me to say like you own yourself. That sounds weird to say. So it sounds like my understanding of mechanism is a little off, maybe.
Well, I could say by owning the mechanism in this case, I could say, okay, this mechanism acts without manipulation. Like
okay.
this is I own this. This is insofar as it is mine, it isn't influenced by any other agent. No other agent is acting through me.
Okay.
Maybe a way to also bring it out, Brian, is saying like, okay, you do a certain action, right? And I say, well, Brian, don't you understand? Like that action resulted from your brain. you'd be like, okay, yeah, I figured that it did, right?
Mhm.
Like you would take ownership of that mechanism. But if I said, Brian, you did this action, I said, Brian, don't you understand? I actually inserted a device into your brain while you were asleep, and it didn't control anything else, but it did actually force you to do that one action. So you had no control over it. Would you feel, oh, is there some sense in which you feel like, oh, that's not me anymore? That's not really my
Yes.
action. Okay.
I do feel that.
Okay. So that's all I think. So Adam's like objection in the previous one was highlighting that, wow,
yeah.
but what about if that mechanism had a second action that just made you radically, it made you accept that, oh, sure, it was the device in my brain, and I'm okay with that, even though you wouldn't have felt that otherwise.
Right.
And
okay.
And Adam's point was, wow, that example fits with this subjective accepting of the mechanism, yet it seems like a situation or a case in which that's obviously not a situation that we want to hold you morally responsible, precisely because you don't, in some sense, own the mechanism. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that does make sense.
Okay, Adam, I was characterizing that correctly, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think the only slight thing I would change there is that in the case that I brought up, it's one in which you wouldn't recognize that there was some sort of device that had made you behave in that way. You would still there would be like this continuity where, 10 days ago I had mechanism ownership, but then suddenly this device was implanted and I didn't know it. But the device itself still continued that continuity of mechanism ownership, that sense where I'm like, I'm still acting, I still have this mechanism is mine. It is not under the influence of any other, malevolent actor in any sense.
Yeah.
But I think this next little sentence here, right after the ones you read, is actually I think it's the biggest trip in the paper in terms of well, I liked this one like 50-50.
I know. Yeah. I've got such mixed feelings about this. I want to dive in.
All right. So he says, further on our view, one takes responsibility for acting from certain general kinds of mechanisms. An individual is morally responsible for acting from a particular mechanism only if he has taken responsibility for acting from mechanisms of that kind. So what I interpreted from that, which is pretty crazy, is I think, Brian, you had just said that, like in the scenario Jordan had given, you're like, okay, I wouldn't take responsibility for that behavior, right? Mm-hmm. Of something implanted in my brain that had made me do that action, right? Like, I don't take responsibility for that.
Mm-hmm. That's not part of my mechanism.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So you're not taking responsibility for acting from mechanisms of that kind. So you're only held responsible for acting from a particular mechanism that you recognize and take ownership for.
Yeah.
Okay. So you could accept that chip is part of your mechanism, and in that scenario,
you could, and that's the problem actually with this.
I see.
Is that
because you can,
but I think what I like about this is that in how it actualizes, I think is pretty good in the sense that most people you talk to and everybody on this podcast would agree that they wouldn't take responsibility for acting from a mechanism like that. So in this case, we wouldn't be morally responsible. We would be kind of shunning or, eschewing responsibility from acting from that mechanism. But you could hypothetically imagine a person, unless they wants to take this perspective on the podcast, but you could imagine, but you could imagine someone who's just genuinely, they're not just saying it, but they're willing to take responsibility for that mechanism acting through them. Mm-hmm. Whether that could just be like the device itself that you know.
Right.
So there could be. I mean, I said it would be madness if you did accept that, but just to be just to be charitable to that position, if like someone listening happens to hold it, I mean, there is kind of a more reasonable style of that where it's like, okay, let's say that there's a device that just amplifies your kind of brain power, for lack of a better technical term, right? So basically, it just allows you to do everything quicker. Doesn't change the outcome of any of your reasoning. It's just everything happens quicker. It seems to me so that's like a very soft case of kind of like edging into accepting a different mechanism, right? Where I could say I'm okay and will take responsibility for anything, for me after time t being like where I get the device implanted. But this is where I was really wondering if the crucial part of what he and I discussed is kind of implicitly at play in a way that would be really nice if it were explicitly brought out, which is that character coherence across time. So basically, I was thinking about this while I was reading the paper. So I guess my suggestion is kind of hearkening on part C of his argument, because so it seems like premises A and B, that the individual sees himself as an agent and that he accepts that he's a fair target of the reactive attitudes, those two seem like they're very susceptible to manipulation, right? By these thought experiments, the devices planted in your brain, right? So I'm wondering if sort of strengthening premise C is what would help buttress his or kind of just shore up the notion here. So the individual's view of himself, as specified in the first two conditions, must be based in an appropriate way on the evidence. Now we'll talk about like what he means by the evidence, because that's tough to nail down on. But what about what about this? What about we were talking about this before, that like the temporal character-based account. So maybe I'm wondering if the standard has to do with what the person's previous self would endorse as a mechanism. And this is exactly what, Adam, you were kind of beginning to bring up. So like me now, let's assume that I am not under the influence of any mechanisms for which I would not accept as my own, right? So let's make it an easy kind of starting point. So right now I would say I eschew anything that I do that results from, for instance, a brain tumor. And we understand that that brain tumor would be, it has to actually be causally linked, right? Like I can't just have a brain tumor and then just like kill Giffin and it's not related at all to the brain tumor.
I appreciate the example.
Yeah. Right. And I'm like, but I had a brain tumor. The doctor's like, it had no causal connection.
What about this notebook from before you got the tumor that says you wanted to kill Giffin?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's just like, I intend to kill Giffin. Yeah. So exactly. So if it's causally connected, I would not accept ownership of any actions that resulted from that, right? Mm-hmm. I also wouldn't do that for a device implanted in my brain. Maybe, given the details. Like I might accept the one that just improves my processing power by 20% or whatever. And let's say that under that example, the increased processing allows me to arrive at a conclusion that I would have arrived at anyway, but quicker, obviously because of the increased processing power. But in the scenario in which I didn't have that device, I actually never would have reached that conclusion, not because I wouldn't have reached it, but because I would have run out of time due to just some pragmatic reason, right? I am currently okay accepting the ownership of the results of that mechanism, even though I also accept that it might be different from who I am now. So I'm wondering if injecting this sort of kind of temporally coherent character-based account is what might, now I don't know if it seals up all the gaps, but I don't know what, maybe Adam specifically, since this was like your biggest thing too, what do you think about that idea for shoring up a little bit of the slipperiness of the mechanism ownership?
I definitely get your point, but I still have some major issues with it.
Yeah.
Because it just seems like you're not owning the mechanism, of your future self that does this, given the change in the mechanism. So, but I just, you could say that about, what about you at the age of 70? You know what I mean? Like, what if you grow up to be some twisted old man? You know what I mean? Just like,
Yeah.
I mean, right now you could disavow a mechanism that would be capable of something that you would do at 70. And that's all in good. You can disavow that mechanism, not take ownership for future behavior, hypothetical behavior. But I still feel like we have to judge the present you. You know what I mean? Where it's like, there is a mechanism in play, even though you've got the tumor,
Yeah.
where that mechanism is different than the mechanism you have now. But to what extent is the future you with the tumor morally responsible? Is it still reasons responsive? I mean,
Yeah. So I don't think that the character coherence can replace like another standard. You know what I mean? Like it's clearly, you're pointing out, it's clearly it's weaker than either Frankfurt's second order desire or a reasons responsive account. Like you can't just say like, okay, well, it coheres with your character, therefore you're morally responsible, right? Because I mean, there's obvious counterexamples to that. But I'm wondering if not, there's like a really slippery kind of notion here where it's like, because clearly your character changes over time. That's obvious. But I also have the obvious intuition, and Fischer and I talked about this, where too radical a change or too quick a change does look like it does kind of beg the question, like, what went wrong? You know what I mean? So like, Adam, if you wake up tomorrow and you've got a Trump 2024 sign on your car, I'm going to be like, okay, what went wrong? Like, no, not like you're responsible for that.
It would seem like a discontinuity.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. It's just like,
so wait,
I guess they could fall into like the pattern where it's like, there seems to be a discontinuity almost in the pattern, where you could imagine like a pattern can subtly change in how you recognize sufficient reasons over time. But there would be an abrupt discontinuity in your pattern of recognizing sufficient reasons if this happened within a day. So I'm happy to like, kind of sign off on that. So
because I don't like this. These are just like extremely loose thoughts, which is why I don't know. I'm struggling because there's obviously, it seems clear that this fits into the theory somehow, but what does it supersede and what is it subservient to? I don't know. And sort of how does it fit in with the mechanism ownership? I don't know. Actually, can I?
Like, what about like a scenario in which like some sort of crime of passion? Like in the moment, you might not be moderately reasons responsive. No. Like honestly, you might actually be incapable of recognizing sufficient reasons that you otherwise would have 3 hours ago. So like, to what extent do you own the mechanism at that time?
Yeah.
To what extent are you reasons responsive? And to what extent are you actually responsible in this framework for that behavior? Like I think there are a lot of issues.
It's so good. The question you asked is so good because you could almost ask it another way, which is like a challenge to Fischer's challenge of Frankfurt, which is basically, are you just don't you succumb to the same issues that Frankfurt does with the unwilling addict in that case then?
Yeah.
It's just the very cases where it seems like we want to hold you responsible are the very cases in which like you had no control. Like
you've lost your reason responsiveness.
Yeah, exactly. And like it's extremely plausible too. Like that. Oh, and by the way, I need to throw this out there. I'm actually plagiarizing that. That was from a conversation I had with a friend last night.
Oh, okay.
About this. Yeah. She's very
Okay.
insightful about these things. And she
Okay,
came up with that one
interesting.
on the fly. She's like, I have an issue with this. And she gave that example. And I'm like,
Okay.
okay, I'm bringing up that example because
That's a great example.
Because that seemed like I'm like, yeah, we wouldn't hold you responsible because you're not responsive in that moment.
Yeah,
So,
and then it's like, and then I mean, you really can raise the exact same style of critique against Fischer that he raises against Frankfurt, which is like, okay, look at the scenario in which I'm just, I eat the donut. Like I'm not actually reasons responsive in some of those situations. Some I probably am, but some I'm just like, you just get overpowered by like the fuck it, essentially. Do you know what I mean?
It is like pure chemical impulse.
There's like
Nothing's going to overpower your desire for sugar.
You could imagine like you could imagine like snarling, like, no, I don't recognize it as a reason. It's just going.
Yeah,
a deep argument with your like own past self of like 4 minutes ago, just like incoherent.
Exactly. But the problem is like I'm realizing that's not even like my character-based account. I don't even know if that helps, because the problem is that is a blip in character, right? Like,
in a way, it's like, does that not reflect on you in some like meta way? Like, your action kind of reflect the fact that, in a certain set of circumstances, you did that.
Do have
so
weakness.
that does
exactly
reflect on your character. It's just we didn't previously know that. It gets very difficult to even just like get a tangible grasp on what even like one's character could be.
But it's like Giffin, I totally agree with you. But at the same time, it's like under Fischer's approach here, it's like you've got to own the mechanism. To what extent do you own the mechanism at that blip? You know what I mean? Like it's because it's like crimes of passion do happen where people like. I mean, if you
I
were
doubt
just,
Fischer would like just give that kind of exception to every crime of passion.
No,
Yeah,
he
exactly,
definitely doesn't want to.
But he's committed to that based on just like what we're reading here.
Because I was like, I mean, like when I was talking with this friend, I'm like, I mean, maybe if you were to pull this person off to the side, would they still recognize?
But then all you've done is just introduced an alternate world. It's just the world in which you pull them aside and the one in which you didn't.
No,
right?
I mean, like, again, a potential world, you know what I mean? Like, which like, in which, like, so, again, if you were to pull them aside in that moment, would they recognize sufficient reasons? And the thing is, possibly not. Possibly
what
not.
if they don't? Then what?
Yeah, I mean, like, because I can definitely buy into that people might not be able to recognize sufficient reasons.
People for sure don't.
all the time.
Yeah,
I'd
for
say
sure.
it's
Like,
very common. Yeah.
it's like we have all of us at our worst moments.
But
yeah,
just because you can't recognize a reason doesn't mean you don't have reasons, though.
Sure, yeah. But the very fact that you wouldn't recognize them is what he was hinging, part of his guidance control on.
I'm imagining a scenario where like just like one of those like impulse kind of passion crimes or whatever. Just like the 5 minute ago, you just like sees the actions of like the 5 minutes in the future.
You'd be a horde. Yeah.
This man is not. I recognize no mechanism here,
dude. You don't have to imagine that. That's just me every time I have something with like added sugar. I'm just like, what you ate? Like, what have you done? Like,
you just re-embody your past self and just disavow the moments.
Dude, phenomenologically, it literally is a blip in character. Like, most of the time, I don't succumb to the sweet. But then when I do, it's like, what the hell happened? It's like what? Like, it's just like what? Like, what did you do?
And like, I feel like
I thought we settled this problem. Like
Yes.
myself.
It's like so much of this falls apart with that example, because it's like the individual must see himself as agentic. Or as an agent. And like, Fischer goes on to say, and this must be based upon the evidence, where it's not that you must actually be an agent that's based on the evidence, but you must see yourself.
Yeah.
And the seeing yourself as an agent needs to be based on the evidence. So it's more of just like an epistemic claim, as he says. So, but even that, it's like, in that moment, do you see yourself as an agent? Where you're just acting out blind rage, you know what I mean?
And
like,
especially in reflection, I don't think you would. Yeah.
So I feel like
This
a
is
lot of this has a major issues with examples like that.
here's what we're definitely reading a paper next by Susan Wolf about defending an asymmetry between positive and negative actions in this sense, because I I don't know exactly what her paper says, but here's my intuition before reading it. We'll do an intuition check for me before and after the paper.
God.
I feel like I feel like if I reflect on like, I applied to UCR today. Was I responsible for what I did? Yes. Did I act in character? Yes. Am I gonna? I'll own the mechanism for all of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I happened to, I didn't today, but like, what if I had eaten a donut? No, I'd be like, no, like I don't relate to that person.
I deny this person.
Yeah, it's like clearly okay. Like I did it. I'm not saying like I wasn't causally responsible for like the disappearance of the donut, but
Right.
like, so the problem is that you can. It's just I wonder if like.
Is Susan's Wolf paper
if you-
claiming that there's an asymmetry between the positive and like the negative?
I don't
aspect?
know. I've just skimmed it, so I don't want to like say something that misrepresents it. But it seems
Okay.
like she defends an asymmetry between sort of positive and negative actions in that sense.
That's
which-
very curious.
Yeah, interesting.
It seems to map on just like based on your like description without having read it. It sounds like it maps onto kind of like our behaviors in general. It's like the urge, the impulse to like take responsibility for like the positive things, align with it, and then just whenever you see that negative aspect of yourself come out, you're like, what a cretin. This is like not me in any way.
Which is funny because it also goes back to his critique of, and this isn't a critique that we found particularly powerful, I don't think, but it goes back to his critique that Frankfurt's account is parasitic on this kind of hierarchy of self. And actually, I think I really believe this, but I think Adam, you did too, right? Where it was like that's not an issue for us at all. But the problem is that like I wonder if reason's responsiveness is a little bit parasitic on that too, where it's like there does seem to be a hierarchy coming out where in the moments where you are reasons responsive, those are higher in value than the reason or the cases where you're not. Even though it could track character or not over time and be the same mechanism or not over time.
Yeah, and also just kind of going off of your invocation of Frankfurt there. Honestly, when you were talking about the donut, I felt myself naturally slipping back into like the Frankfurt model there, where it was like, honestly,
yeah,
I actually wouldn't see you as like
you're just the unwilling addict.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's completely compulsive behavior where it's like I don't think it's a like one of the critiques you were just mentioning was like the fact that okay, like this hierarchy has been imposed, but it's not self-evident that there should be a hierarchy. I completely disagree with that. There's definitely like second order desires, especially in this case, where it's like at that moment where you ate the donut,
I wanted it.
Like
I didn't want to.
Exactly. Like whether like those thoughts, like whether you were cognizant of the second order desires at that point, it doesn't make a difference to me. Where it's like after eating that donut, like you didn't want to eat that donut, but you did anyway. And now you see yourself as just like you said, the unwilling addict. And it's like, yeah, I do too. You know what I mean? Like I would see you that way too, where it's like, it really, that's not behavior that or it's not a desire you wanted to become actionable. Well, because like it's compulsive and you're not responsible for it. That's crazy.
Do you remember? Did you remember in the 2012 paper that we previously read? Fischer had some remark about this very point where he said, I don't remember the exact language, but he said, let's assume that you have a desire to indulge in some vice. And I don't remember what the vice was, but it was something like this. The donut will work.
Vape.
And he
You want a jewel.
Adam's like, not a vice? Doesn't count.
Yeah. Actually, it goes all the way up for me in terms of desires. I want to
at the fourth level. It just
yeah. I want to hit this vape.
It's just water. How bad could it be?
I want to just like the smoke clouds below.
Yeah.
I'll compete every order of every desire.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He organizes life around vaping.
Want I save this child or take a hit?
It doesn't matter whether I can whether this is my ideal ego or my or my true self, because either fully endorses this behavior.
Exactly. But so the donut will work for that example. And so he says, let's imagine that this is a resistible desire, but he doesn't, it's not like a heroin addiction, which is just, physiologically addictive. Like no one really, besides like, kind of like crazy Republicans, blame heroin addicts.
Yeah,
right?
You have a chip inside your head.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah. You got a chip in your veins in that example.
Yeah, general addiction.
Yeah. So Fish is saying, okay, like it's not that. It's just like you just really want a donut, and this is a desire that you could and should be able to resist. On one sense, we do pragmatically think about it in that way, right? Like, but in another sense, doesn't it really come down to just if you do resist it or not? If you don't resist it, was it really resistible? Like, it
not for you, evidently.
Not for you in that time. Like under those conditions, it wasn't. And this goes back. I guess this goes back to the previous, discussion in which, like, okay, in what sense is like alternative possibilities relevant to his example? And yeah, you still have the general abilities that you have, right? Going back to his like piano example, but in that case, I didn't have, and this is where I really wonder if Frankfurt's account is better at conceptualizing cases of weak-willed action specifically than Fischer's account, where it's like, to Adam's point, I actually really do naturally think about it in terms of orders of desires. I don't think about it as like, was I properly reasons responsive in that case? It's just, did my desires align or did they not?
Yeah, I honestly, in that case, I'm totally with like the Frankfurt model. But then like honestly, like going through some reasons responsiveness here, like there are
I feel the pull of all of that too. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like I was just trying to like conceptualize like reasons responsiveness to an extent. And I think for me, like the logic went like this, where it was, okay, let's just say for arguments that you are responsible for your mechanism, right? Like, let's imagine that your cause is sui, right? So it's incoherent. I know.
But continue.
I know.
Yeah.
But
you must continue.
But like in this framework of like semi-compatibilism here, say you were presented with all the reasons for and against doing something, and you decide one way, but you couldn't have decided otherwise. I'm perfectly fine for that. Like, I'm perfectly fine with that. I mean, like how
yes.
I can't imagine any other circumstance where it's like you have a mechanism that is recognizing reasons for and against, weighing the strength of those reasons, and then acting upon those reasons. Why would you ever act differently? Given
that the reasons were the same, you mean?
Given that the reasons were the same.
Yeah.
Because in this circumstance, like all the reasons, you've been provided all possible reasons.
All the reasons, yes.
All possible reasons. Why would the outcome be any different? Like why would you view one reason as one reason as stronger than another? It's like, is that simply a random? Is that random that you would view one as stronger than the other?
RNG is a component to the reasoning.
Another way of asking this is just, why would you even desire libertarian free will, right? Like what does that even get you? Yeah,
I'm not even sure where it comes in at this point. I think that is just like, it just completely drops out, where it's like, okay, no matter like whether you view it as like the mind or the soul or just some general mechanism, there should be you should arrive at a decision. Freedom, brother. Yeah, like you should arrive at a decision that you make actionable, that is based on how that mechanism views the respective reasons, weighs them, and then makes a decision. It shouldn't be based on anything else.
And this is a point that I've heard, like we've moved away from his, because he has like a very, I don't want to say simplistic, but like the resolution isn't as specific as all of these papers. But like Sam Harris has made this point in many talks before, but he's like, that's exactly what it means to reason. Like you're driven from behind essentially by these reasons. Like When like it's exemplified in the case of you, Adam, reading the previous paper. You were a fan of Frankfurt. You thought that his view was the best view. You were out picketing for him, and then you read the 2012 paper, and you're like, okay, these are gut punches to like a fan of Frankfurt, and that is not due to you being able to weigh the reasons pro and con and then just decide irrespective of the reasons what to. It's like that. Why would you even want that? Like,
yeah,
what would you be deciding based on then? It would just be
exactly
almost not even deciding at that point.
No,
exactly.
Just doing.
It's like Wolf's point about like being in just neither like the reactive or the objective stance, but just with this analogy, it's like you're just neither conforming nor disconforming with reasons. It's just like you're like raw chaos at that point.
Exactly. Like I've been presented with all the reasons, and I could have chosen one way, but then I also could have chosen the other way. And like like one reason, was especially strong for me in one case, but then wasn't so much in the other case. Well, why? I mean, you know what I mean? And it's like you can imagine that situation based on just pure randomness. But otherwise, it's like, I don't know where you get, free will in that case. You know what I mean? Just like it's like
any freedom worth having is like, I think, as Fischer says somewhere. Can we return and maybe we'll start to kind of close down the episode a little bit, but I was thinking about, I don't know what this might elucidate. I know what I was thinking before this conversation, but maybe just returning a little bit to the character point. Can I read the case of Chum? Because I was
Please.
because I was thinking about how the character kind of impulse that we're drawn to fits in with respect to that example. So okay, this is Fischer quoting Judish, who has a response to Fischer. So this is Judish. Consider the case of Chum. Aside from the unfortunate name, what were his parents thinking? Chum is a perfectly ordinary adult. He was raised in a happy home, received a normal moral education, and took responsibility when a young man for his mechanisms in order of ordinary practical reasoning and the like. Never once was he subjected to the slightest form of manipulation, and his moral and social development has left him a well-adjusted and responsible man. Now suppose that one night, while Chum is soundly asleep, he spontaneously develops a debilitating brain lesion. The lesion is situated in his neural network in such a way that his capacity for practical reasoning is severely impaired. The relevant mechanism no longer even approximates the standard of moderate reason's responsiveness. Imagine now that a benevolent neuroscientist, Dr. White, is somehow made aware of Chum's plight. Without rousing Chum, he springs into action. Unfortunately, there is no way he can remove the lesion without causing irreparable damage to Chum's brain, but White has a few handy electronic devices that enable him literally to get around that problem. Here's how the devices work. The first, planted just upstream of the lesion, takes as inputs the messages sent through the neural pathways headed right for the spot where the lesion is located and transmits the incoming data via radio signals to the other device located just downstream of the lesion, which device in turn relays the appropriate impulses to the neural pathways just downstream of it. The result is that the lesion is both successfully isolated and bypassed, its potentially deleterious effects completely cut off from the rest of Chum's brain. Indeed, Chum's post-surgery cognitive architecture is functionally equivalent to his pre-surgery brain. When Chum awakens, he is, of course, completely unaware of the evening's events. As far as he is concerned, it is business as usual. That's first of all, it's a very cool thought experiment.
Very.
But secondly, so this is Fischer in response to that. Judish's view is that Chum can legitimately be considered morally responsible for his subsequent behavior. He contends, however, that on the Fischer-Revisa approach, Chum cannot be deemed morally responsible. After all, we contend that if scientists manipulate your brain in a clandestine fashion, you have not taken responsibility for the mechanism that actually issues in your behavior, the manipulation mechanism. And it seems to Judish that we should say the same thing about the case of Chum. Now, he goes on to talk about why he, is not necessarily committed to that conclusion, but I kind of wanted to think about the case of Chum from that character account. So it seems like, and Fischer kind of talks about this, there's an important difference here between cases of restoration versus manipulation, right? And I want to table kind of status quo bias for a second, right? But it's like, so it seems clear to me that Chum is obviously exactly as morally responsible post surgery as he was before. Do you guys match that intuition too? I'm assuming, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if I ask myself why I believe that, it's because there's no functional difference, right? And but I was wondering if also it was due to the fact that if Chum were, because here's I think there's two implicit things working here, but I want to kind of ask you guys a question about this. The first thing is that it seems implicit that, and almost explicit, that Chum regular and Chum prime with the device would do the exact same things in both alternate worlds, right? That seems implicit, almost nearly explicit. And then secondly, it also seems like if Chum were to be told of that evening's events, that he would accept that mechanism ownership. And I see that Adam agrees with that. I find that to be implicit in the thought example as well. And I think that is where some of my intuitions were trying to drive at with the character-based account of mechanism ownership, where if you, because I would accept that mechanism, right? If it's functionally equivalent, you three would accept that as well, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just...
But then take it up.
Exactly.
So because I'm glad you brought up this one, because this is, I was going the same way you were.
Great.
Where it's like, okay,
so
well,
take it up then,
yeah, we've done this with one part of the brain, but we're going to replace every part of the brain.
Yes.
With this same technology, but we have to mention that it's functionally equivalent. Would you still take mechanism ownership if it's functionally equivalent, but it's a completely robotic brain?
I would.
Yeah, I would.
If it's functionally equivalent, I would. And I think that the thing that is the thread tying this together is the character coherence over time, because I think that it discouples. So if my intuitions are being coherent here, what I've just discovered about myself is that I don't care about the specific details of the mechanism. I care that they match, and it's about the matching that matters to me. So I would eschew or disavow moral responsibility, even if the change looked more similar but had a different function expressed in my character. So if, one small part of my brain were swapped with a cadaver brain that it functioned, but it didn't function equivalently, I wouldn't own that mechanism, because I'd be like, that's not me, in the same sense that, like, if I came to if anything were functionally different because of that surgery, that would be less me. Adam, are you agree?
Well, I totally agree, but I'm just imagining that scenario, the cadaver brain
is the thing
you're waking up and then
yes.
Taking ownership of that mechanism
exactly
at that point, and then in your body at that point. So it's like,
so we've got to, you're right, I've got to stipulate that the part of your brain that was replaced is not the same part that would, so let's say that the part of your brain has mostly to do with I don't remember what part of the brain this actually is, but with coarse motor function, right? So I'm not as good as, me prime, pretty decent at throwing a football. I get in a car accident, one part of my brain is damaged and it gets replaced with a cadaver brain, or it gets replaced with this neural link, software, whatever, or hardware, whatever it is, right? But after that, I'm no longer as good at throwing the football. There's a sense in which I take absolutely no responsibility for my degradation there, because I don't own that like I don't accept that mechanism. And it would actually be the same thing on the plus side too. It's just that I would have I'd be like, well, yeah, I'm not responsible. It was kind of sick that I'm like an NFL quarterback at this point. You know what I mean? But I wouldn't.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
Okay, so if this happened when you were like 5 years old for the rest of your life, would you not accept your mechanism? Am I misunderstanding?
Well, I wouldn't accept anything that. Accept is a weird. I don't know. It depends what you mean by accept. I wouldn't.
Well, it's subjective, so it's like you kind of define your own mechanism, right?
No, I meant a different. I meant a different like way of accept. So I would. I wouldn't sort of like.
Okay.
Any positive results from that, I'd happily accept. Like I'm not going to not use my newfound abilities, right? But I wouldn't see myself as responsible for them in the same way that I am for my non-altered.
Okay.
Why? I actually have a different intuition on that.
I was gonna say.
I think we've got a weird delay.
Okay.
Okay, but Giffin and I have different intuitions.
Yeah.
I think we resynced here. Is everyone hearing me at the same time?
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, but I think Brian's delayed. Yeah, I think Brian, you're delayed.
Okay. I think my internet's shit.
That sounds better now. That was pretty quick.
That was pretty quick. Okay, wait, sorry. So Adam and Giffin, I missed what you said because of the delay.
Yeah. So I honestly am imagining myself accepting like ownership over a mechanism in a case similar to what we're describing. So let me give you an example, maybe. So a lesion develops in my brain overnight, and then the doctor comes in, and he's able to like get ridiculously close to the previous mechanism, but it's like slightly different post, right? Maybe like the consequence of this is like I have a marginally increased propensity to like consume cheese, like something that's really like small, right? I think post, even being told that like there was a slight change, I'd probably take ownership.
But wait, is that because you're okay with eating more cheese? Or is because you actually are okay with the mechanism? Would you feel that way about if you were had a slightly higher propensity to commit murder, right? I don't think you would.
Well, on the one thing is if it's so close, like if the change is very minuscule, I think my answer is actually yes.
Now.
Yeah. If I am marginally more like inclined towards murder, like it probably wouldn't manifest over like just one lifetime unless I was already very close to like committing murder.
Well, but the problem
I don't think it's more about like whether you do or don't. Yeah. But for me, I actually completely align with Giffin. Yeah, I mean, because the thing is,
I would take ownership. Like, would I eat a little more cheese, or like, in a way that won't manifest?
But I think that's only because you're okay with the outcome.
No, I'm talking about I'm talking about like even being a little more murderous. Because the thing is like,
no, I'm serious.
I mean, I'll take your real example there. Because I mean, here's the thing: like, if you ask me now whether like I take ownership for some potential, more murderous self, the answer might be no right now. But actually embodying that mechanism, yes, I'm gonna take ownership of that mechanism. Like I think there are several different parts of the mechanism ownership where it's like I would still subjectively view myself agentically. I still would, even though I can recognize that there's, but because the thing is like,
I have a question.
I mean, like we change throughout our lives, right? And that would be an abrupt change, of course. But I'm going to accept the changes in my personality and in my mechanism. And even if I got into a car crash, like you just described, where something changed about me, I would recognize that there was a physical change, but I would still view myself agentically. Because, I mean, how would I view myself otherwise? It's just kind of, we naturally have that view of ourselves agentically. So
I thought that this was the very kind of reductio that you had initially raised against merely subjective ownership. Is because
it is, but the thing is, would I still take ownership? I don't, because the thing is, what we talked about was whether these two criteria could constitute this semi-compatibilistic moral responsibility? Is it robust? Like, does this
Yes.
actually constitute moral responsibility, a framework in which it obtains? No, no, I don't think so, based on that second area where I don't think
Okay.
mechanism ownership, the subjectivity of it.
Oh, you're
I-
saying
I-
you would accept the mechanism, but that it's not going to fit the moral responsibility is not going to obtain.
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
I-
So yeah. So I'm saying
okay.
I'm saying I still would, but
Okay.
I don't fundamentally think that second
Okay,
point.
okay.
Do you understand what I'm talking
I
about?
disagree.
Yeah.
I still disagree, but I disagree way less than
Really, you don't think you would take responsibility, like for example,
that I would
like,
accept it. You take
no,
ownership.
no,
of
no,
it?
no, like they know that, yeah, you would take ownership of,
The mechanism.
because I'm actually surprised by that, because I'm not saying
No, I don't think
really.
Yeah. So, okay. I have a follow up question to understand the gravity of what you're saying because I misunderstood it before. So I want to see if I'm getting it right now.
Okay.
Okay. So world alpha is the world we're currently in. World beta is the one after you get into a car accident and have the device implanted, right?
Sure.
The propensity of action X, I don't care what it is, of you doing action X is slightly increased by the device. In world alpha, you live the rest of your life having never done that act. But the increased propensity in world beta makes you actually commit that act. So there's an actualized difference between the two. So you don't think that you are that moral responsibility obtains in the second sense, but there's some way in which it's rational to accept the difference in manifestation there. That's what you're saying?
Well, I'm not even sure it's rational to
Okay.
accept
You're saying you would.
to accept any mechanism, as we're not responsible for these mechanisms.
Mhm.
But I'm just saying that you would. I mean, like, did you ever suffer?
Would.
Did you ever suffer a concussion?
Probably,
Like,
but not diagnosed. Yeah.
same here.
Yeah.
And I noticed like that after I had done football, after I had suffered never diagnosed, but I certainly
Mhm.
did suffer a concussion. I did
A
stutter.
little fuzzy. Yeah.
I had some stuttering issues. So, and there was never, there were points that I associated the concussion with the stutter, but never did I not take ownership for the stutter.
For the rest of his life, he'd never,
Okay. Can I ask a question then? Okay. So I have a God's eye view of this, and I tell you that instance of stuttering was a stutter that would not have occurred had you not gotten the concussion. There's a sense in which I accept that concussion or that stutter less. Now it's tough because I obviously would accept, you and I probably got concussions wrestling, and I accept, my second order desires align. Like I wanted to wrestle, I want to wrestle, right? So it's tough because like you're accepting the means by which you acquired the stutter, right? But
Sure.
but there is, and that really stacks the deck, to be honest. But
also, I have to interject here because you got to
Yeah.
remember that it's subjective ownership mechanism.
yes.
So, mechanism ownership, subjective mechanism ownership. So I'm talking about a subjective.
Yeah. No, yeah.
So, even if
that's
you were
the
to give
key.
me like a God's eye view and say that,
Mhm.
had this concussion not occurred, you
Yeah.
would not be stuttering. I wouldn't be able to divorce, I think, my feelings on the ownership of that.
Okay, here's what I
From-
think you're getting at that I actually completely agree with. The subjective acceptance is clearly a necessary condition, but it's also clearly not a sufficient one. So
Yeah.
in all situations in which you do not subjectively accept the mechanism, you can't be responsible. But merely knowing that you do accept it is not enough.
Sure.
There's got to be, and the not enough is the part that I think that we think Fischer needs to develop more.
Exactly.
Or I know
Exactly.
that I think, yeah.
Exactly. But I do believe it is necessary. Not sufficient. And I also think it's
Okay. Oh, wait. Just this thought just occurred. Okay. Is that where I'm trying to cram the character peg into then? like the coherence for the subjective acceptance across time, where it's like you, because it was in your character to wrestle and you were like, yeah, I know there's a risk of a concussion and stuttering that might occur from it, and then you do get the concussion, there was some stuttering that resulted from it, but that was still in your character and you still accepted it, right? And the reason why we find the case of just, you go to sleep, a device is implanted in your brain, it induces an action that you wouldn't have otherwise done. That's so jarring because of the stark discontinuity. So it's almost about like the rate of change, or it's about the rate and the severity of the change and the source of the change.
No, it could even be random for me. Like, I mean, I'm going to take ownership subjectively of some sort from a car crash.
Oh, yeah. But
so it doesn't have to be like in character that I somehow had this stark discontinuity that, okay, well, it could be explained because you wanted to wrestle. And therefore,
well,
Giffin, am I capturing your views well? Because I know you and I are both, I mean, I just want to make sure.
You seem to be describing roughly kind of what I was intuiting.
Because you feel the same way subjectively.
No,
right?
yeah, I'm trying to, like, I was thinking of some more examples of instances where, because like we gave the example of like a car crash being like an impetus for like a change, even if it's like a minor change. And Jordan, you were saying like the propensity to do the thing is actualized. Mm-hmm. And the God comes down and tells you that, there would be a difference.
Really quick, can I ask before we change examples, were you going to change examples?
Yeah, I was going to give a separate example.
Right. Real quick before you do that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Let's say you're in a car crash and it wasn't your fault, right? So let's not make it muddy. If your legs are like just mangled and paralyzed, right? Mm-hmm. I wouldn't subjectively own that change.
Well, is that a mechanism difference?
Well, when it comes to the ability for you to exercise guidance control over something like walking, yeah. So
suddenly you can't make the car fly.
yeah, exactly.
The Republicans give you a pass on this instance.
Yeah, exactly. So, but then suddenly, and that seems like it's an obvious case of one in which you wouldn't accept the change, subjective change, and you wouldn't subjectively accept the change in mechanism. But then when it's your brain, it seems like you would descriptively have a higher likelihood to accept it. But I wonder if that's just because it's like it's harder to kind of, I don't know. There's some difference there that I'm questioning the relevance
so real quick,
of. Yeah.
I kind of view a mechanism as yourself, right? So I am my mechanism.
Source of an action.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So your legs have now gone. You can't use them anymore. Sure. So before your mechanism is I can use my legs, I can walk around, I'm Brian, whatever. And then afterwards, your mechanism is I can't use my legs. That's what's changed. So when you say accept, it sounds to me like you're just rejecting that your legs can't move.
No.
Or you're saying that's not Jordan. Jordan has legs that can move. That works. This is not Jordan. Okay, I think my internet's really bad.
I think it's really bad. And I don't think you own that mechanism.
It's like really. No, I think I'm just gonna listen for the rest of the discussion.
That's honestly why we were smiling there for a second, because like
it was a crazy delay.
Yeah, the delay, your voice didn't match up with the video, so you'd be kind of like drifting to the side, but there would just be like
just voice, but just a smile on your face.
Yeah,
no movement. A bad dub.
Yeah, it was like a bad over those like Japanese movies that like they just dub over it.
Did not even try to change the
you hear Brian, I've ascended with just a smile as he projects his thoughts.
I sort of lost our train of thought there.
Brian had a point about the crippled leg example and like whether or not you own the mechanism versus like accepting the change.
Yeah. So I was pointing to like the legs were supposed to be an example in which I didn't have guidance control due to a loss of mechanism ownership. Because me now, I don't actually know all of the biology behind it, but I exercise guidance control over my legs, right? I want to move my legs. I intend to move my legs. I move my legs, right?
Mhm.
If I were in a car crash in which my spinal cord was, destroyed, um, or actually don't even that is what would result in me being paralyzed, right? My ignorance of biology was showing there, but like,
Sounds about right.
um, that is so I don't have guidance control in that scenario, but I wouldn't be tempted to subjectively accept the change in mechanism there.
Oh, I actually am not sure if I am intuiting like the use of mechanism there, because I'm
Yeah.
imagining like this this is like relative to something. So like
Yeah.
you like, for instance, like after you were paralyzed, you wouldn't like, if your legs moved in such a way that it like caused damage to someone else, like you accidentally like not kicked, but
Yeah, like they like
that's a sort of,
spasmed or whatever.
yeah, right. Like
Yeah.
you could say like I no longer have that control, but like the
Yeah.
mechanism, I don't.
But the mechanism has changed, right? So it's like before, if my leg, flies out and kicks,
Yeah,
it's because I
yeah, you
because
jumped
I
and kicked someone.
yeah, like I kicked you there. But
Yeah.
in the one in which like, my like just nerves fire, right? The mechanism is changed there, and I wouldn't subjectively own that second mechanism. But then it seems weird that like I would be tempted, and I'm honestly so we might be talking past each other in that Adam might be talking purely descriptively, and I'm accidentally lapsing into normative discussions about this. Frankly, I just don't know. Like, you can stipulate that I would descriptively accept a neural change in mechanism, right? Because maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. But I don't think that it's weird to. This is why I think that it's a sufficient but not necessary condition, because even if I would accept it, it doesn't seem to me like that gives a lot of power, because it could be resultant from something that's just totally, in the same way that the loss of leg function is. And maybe Adam and I actually aren't disagreeing at all. Maybe I've just understood now kind of the totality of what I'm thinking.
I don't think we do, but just going off your
Yeah.
example there real fast, I actually don't view it too differently from the piano example, actually.
Yeah.
Where it's like, if you have the intention to walk, to me, that's almost like, in a sense, you have the capacity to walk, but you can't exercise that capacity to walk considering
Yes.
you have a spinal injury. So
Yes.
it's almost as though,
Yeah.
so in the same way of like, the piano, the hands being chained, like you have
And
the
it-
capacity, but but you
Just
can't
The
exercise that
hands stay
capacity.
chained. That's that.
And this
Yeah,
is
exactly.
what.
So I view those
Okay,
very
okay.
similar.
But you would still have
So-
a mechanism for which, like, for other actions, you could
and,
still
and,
own.
and even if you didn't subjectively own a mechanism, but you still succumbed in the case of a bad outcome to that example over and over again, that is a perfect example of what this is like. Kind of the thing I was harping on the first part of the series is about, like, evaluations of character. That seems like a pristine example in which you're not morally responsible, but we can make important evaluations about the type of person you are, right? Like, this person is a person who can't play the piano, or has legs that spasm, so don't stand too close to them, or can't help himself but eat a donut, or in the case of Charles Whitman, murder.
Mhm.
So, or Robert Harris from the one that we actually read. So it seems like, yeah, those distinctions in character evaluations can remain.
Also, I think Frankfurt's well invoked in your example as well.
Yeah.
In like in the sense that you might have like a second order volition to walk, like you really want to walk.
Yes,
You know
yes,
what
but you
I mean?
can't,
So,
yeah.
but
And guidance control in Frankfurt's view would just be the ability to sort of exercise your first order desires. That would be how he would view guidance control, right?
yeah, actually, now I'm thinking about my example the real fast. Actually, it doesn't make as much sense considering. I mean, if you were truly bedridden, would you want to walk?
You might not actually.
Yeah.
You might want to just have
Yeah.
that desire to cease.
Yeah, you might not want to walk.
That's true.
So
Yeah.
but I either way, it's like
You can imagine you're recovered perfectly fine, a couple days later or something.
Yeah.
but like perhaps like you weep in bed because you want to walk, but you don't want to walk because you can't.
The wanting to want to walk. The wanting to walk
because it's just
suffering.
Yeah, so
it's
almost
painful. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's almost like
I see
you're
what
not
you're saying.
you're not responsible for the manifestation of that behavior at that point based on the wanting to walk because you don't want to walk. And you want that to be actionable because wanting to walk only causes you pain.
Yeah.
So I do like that framework still for evaluating
Yeah.
situations like that.
I don't know if we've answered definitively any questions in my mind, but I think that we've definitely raised very good, at least I think more of my intuitions cohere than they previously did. Maybe, but maybe some actually are more disparate than they ever were. I don't know. I think I want to kind of simmer on some of this stuff, and moving tangentially away with the wolf paper might be a good way to do that. So we might move slightly off. Although, like I said, I don't actually know the complete depth of that paper. So let's move to that paper because it might be one of those examples where being away from a specific kind of part of the literature makes me kind of cohere what I think about it a little bit more. Okay.
See the forest for the trees.
Yeah, I'm up in the trees right now for sure.
Yeah, let's step back.
Okay, nice. All right, well, that'll do it for this episode then. I hope listeners enjoyed this, even if it was just this episode more than most was seeing how much intuitions could cohere. But I think it's good though, because hopefully listeners were kind of getting primed along the way themselves. So, all right, tune in next time for more moral responsibility.